This video is all about killer bees. Do I have your attention yet? Well, I absolutely hate that term, killer bees. It's the name given to Africanized honeybees. It really is a catchy name. It makes the public look at and think about these bees. And I'm going to use this video to demystify the killer bee, give you the right name, talk about its biology and behavior, and tell you why people even think about it at all. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about honeybee biogeography. I love this topic. I'm in danger of chasing this rabbit much too far, but I'll just say that there are a handful of species of honeybees. And so when I say honeybees, I mean members of the genus Apis. That's A-P-I-S. There's probably a dozen or so of these species, things like Apis dorsata, Apis laboriosa, Apis cerana, florea, andreniformis, koschevnikovi, etc. All of these are species of Apis that live in Asia, most in Southeast Asia, but in other parts of Asia as well. Excise from that species list, Apis mellifera. This is the western honeybee. This is the bee that has a natural distribution in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And just like there are different races of people, there are different races of Apis mellifera. There are European races, Middle Eastern races, or African races. And I'll tend in this video to use the word race and subspecies interchangeably. They're not technically the same. It's more appropriate to say that there are different subspecies of Apis mellifera in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. In the US, where we are filming this video series, we have European-derived subspecies of Apis mellifera. A lot of beekeepers in the US and elsewhere will call these European bees. They're not European bees. They were brought to the United States hundreds, up to 400 years ago, depending on the type of stock that we have. As a scientist, I much prefer to call these European-derived honeybees, or stocks of bees derived from European subspecies that were brought into the US. The reason we talk about African bees at all, or Africanized bees, or bees that the press calls killer bees, is because clearly we have one of the African-derived subspecies in the Americas that became known as the African or Africanized bee, or the killer bee. With that in mind, I want to give an introduction on what this bee is and really the more appropriate term. Beekeepers in South America, specifically in Brazil, as is relevant to this story, but broadly in South America, were using European-derived subspecies of honeybees in these tropical and subtropical climates that you would experience in much of South America. These bees were fine, but they weren't thriving and producing as much honey possibly as they could have produced. A Brazilian scientist in the 1950s then said to himself, well, Apis mellifera is not just distributed in Europe, like the subspecies that we have where they came from, it's also distributed in Africa on many of the same latitudes that we, as Brazilian scientists and beekeepers, have in our particular country. This scientist then imported those queens into Brazil. He had them in a breeding program. Some of them escaped, and the rest is history. So I really want to help you think about this contextually when I think about the name of this bee. The bee that was imported into Brazil actually was a western honeybee subspecies named Apis mellifera, genus and species of the western honeybees, but Apis mellifera scutellata. This particular subspecies occurs in much of sub-Saharan Africa, from Central Africa all the way down to southern parts of Africa. In Africa, they often refer to it as scutellata. It's the type of honeybee they have over a wide part of Africa. Many beekeepers use this bee preferentially because it's the subspecies they have. When that bee was brought to the Americas, it was put into these breeding programs, and when it escaped, it hybridized with European-derived stock that was already present in the area. How could this happen? Well, one of the definitions of species is that members of a species can interbreed and produce viable offspring. European stocks of honeybees can mate with African stocks of honeybees because they're all Apis mellifera. So the European-derived stocks already present in the area were interbreeding with these now scutellata populations that were brought into the area and producing this hybrid bee referred to as Africanized bees. Again, nomenclature is very important to me, but I also have to be fair and say that a lot of people use these names interchangeably. The stocks in South America can't be African bees anymore because they've been in South America for decades. They are derived from an African lineage that happens to be Apis mellifera scutellata. This term African bee anyway is a bit of a misnomer because there's probably 10 or 12 subspecies of Apis mellifera in Africa. So how does scutellata represent all of the populations and get the name the African honeybee? Scientifically, like for European-derived stocks, I prefer to call this an African-derived stock. But usually what you'll see in the press and among other scientists and beekeepers is someone sticking the I-Z-E-D to the end of African, so Africanized bees. And when someone says Africanized bees, they really mean hybrids of these European-derived and African-derived stocks that mated in South America in the 1950s. If that was the end of the story, I wouldn't even be doing a video about this bee because you would have never heard of it. I probably would have never heard of it. But of course, the rest is history. Once this bee was introduced into Brazil and hybridized with local European stocks, it spread throughout South America, throughout Central America, and into the United States and other parts of North America. In fact, in the United States, it was found in the 1990s, and I want you to think about what I just said. If it was introduced into Brazil in the 1950s and made it to the US in the 1990s, then this bee spread thousands of kilometers on its own in a short period of time. The initial beekeeper reaction to these Africanized honeybees was to stay away from them. They have heightened defensive behavior. They didn't want to work them. So quickly, this bee moved through this continent and a half really on its own. In fact, because of its rapid spread, some biologists call it the most successful biologically invasive species of all time. All it had to do was be introduced into South America, and it did the rest. Again, I prefer to call it African-derived honeybee stocks, but just to keep it consistent with what you'll see in the literature, I'll refer to this now as the Africanized honeybees. Why do people even care about Africanized honeybees? It largely is based on one behavior that has preceded it reputationally before it even spread. People knew this about this bee, and that behavior is heightened defensiveness. I'm going to talk more about that shortly, but I want to really emphasize something about this bee. It's the same species of honeybee that's kept in Europe, the Middle East, and across Africa. It's the same species of honeybee that's been spread around the world to Australia and other parts. It's just a different subspecies. I get people asking me a lot, how can I identify? How can I know if I've got African-derived honeybees or European-derived honeybees? You probably can't visually. Historically, when scientists were trying to know if they were working with African-derived stock or European-derived stock, they would use morphometric measurements, so body metric measurements. They would use body measurements to know what subspecies or what stock or strain of honeybee they were using. In the US, for example, the USDA put out two very quick ways to measure various body parts, one of those being USDA ID, the second of those being FABIS. They would use one of these two methods to say, okay, we think these are African-derived honeybees, or we think these are European-derived honeybees. More recently, people have been using molecular techniques to be able to identify these bees more accurately, and this is probably the best way to do it anyways. Then we are moving more and more away from morphometric analysis to molecular analysis. But you can't otherwise have the bees in your hand, one that's European-derived and one that's African-derived, and know the difference. They're shaped the same. In some cases, the colors may be the same. If anything, Africanized honeybees are slightly smaller than the European-derived honeybees, but honestly, it's such a meager difference that you'd have to measure that with special scientific tools to know that you are seeing small honeybees. Really, we get most information about their identity today using genetic analysis. Now I'm going to focus on the behavior, what makes people care about them. And you've already heard me refer to this idea of defensiveness. A lot of the general public, when they talk about being attacked by bees, refer to aggressive honeybees. Aggression implies that they wake up in the morning, they seek out victims, and then they go get them. Honeybees are not aggressive, and Africanized honeybees are not aggressive. What they are instead is defensive. They will sting when provoked so they can defend themselves or their nest. Generally speaking, Africanized honeybees have a heightened defensive behavior compared to European honeybees. What does that mean? Well, I've been stung a lot by European-derived honeybee stocks. Therefore, I know that they too can be defensive. When I'm speaking about these levels of defensiveness, I'm speaking in big generalities. In general, Africanized honeybees will defend a larger area around their hive than will European honeybees. They will respond to even lower or smaller stimuli than will European honeybees. They will respond in greater numbers than will European honeybees, and they may respond over greater distances than will European honeybees. And of course, as you can imagine, anytime you compare two different honeybee stocks, generalities are dangerous. And I know many people who say they've worked Africanized honeybee colonies and they're just fine. But in general, it's easier to elicit a defensive response from Africanized honeybee colonies, be attacked in greater numbers, and be followed for longer distances than if you were doing the same stimulus to European honeybee colonies. And that's what really got people scared. They heard the moniker killer bees. These bees are out to get you. They will sting in the thousands. It's certainly true that Africanized honeybees have killed people. It's certainly true that European honeybees have killed people. What you tend to get from a danger perspective is just that greater intensity of response from Africanized honeybees. And that's what people in the Americas were not accustomed to when working with European-derived stocks historically. Now you've got this bee spreading through the Americas with this heightened defensive behavior, and that's when people started piling on it this idea of killer bees and all these terrible movies they made about the killer bees from all over the place. But there are other differences between European-derived honeybee stocks and African-derived honeybee stocks. I don't have time in this video to go through all of them. I'll just say, think about general Apis mellifera development in Europe, where it's typically cooler than in Africa, where bees tend to have to overwinter in colder climates than do bees in Africa. They tend to prefer to nest in larger volume cavities up off of the ground and choose bigger nest sites and store lots of honey and swarm less and do other things compared to African honeybee colonies from Africa that tend to make smaller colonies and may swarm more than European-derived honeybee colonies. They also abscond readily in response to disturbance. They might nest more frequently in the ground than high off of the ground in tree trunks. There are a lot of behavioral differences that you can just experience when you work European-derived honeybee colonies or Africanized honeybees. I know, for example, when I work Apis mellifera scutellata colonies in South Africa or Africanized honeybees in the Americas, I tend to get a lot more bees flying at me when I'm working the nest. I tend to have a greater sting response. I tend to get bees vacating the combs. When I work colonies of Africanized bees, often the bees will leave the combs and form layers on the wall of the boxes, which makes it more difficult to do some things with their nest. So there are very distinguishable behaviors that characterize Africanized honeybees versus the bees that people are traditionally using derived from these European stock. I want to specifically mention the swarming behavior. There's clear research evidence that suggests Africanized honeybee colonies will swarm more frequently. When they move into an environment that they thrive in, they really thrive in it. I know I used the word thrive twice in that sentence, but I'm just making the point. If an area is suited to Africanized honeybee establishment, it is very suited, and the bees will often take over the environment. What do I mean by that? Well, when they move into an area, they quickly become the dominant bee, the dominant honeybee in the feral population. You may have had a few European-derived honeybee colonies nesting in trees and other places in the environment. When Africanized bees move into an area, they quickly displace those bees. They become the dominant bee or honeybee nesting in the environment. Africanized honeybee swarms tend to be less picky than European honeybee colonies when choosing potential nest sites. For example, European honeybee colonies like 40-liter volume cavities that are up off of the ground. Of course, European honeybee colonies can nest in the ground in all these other places, but it's the exception rather than the rule. With Africanized honeybee colonies, their swarms tend to be smaller than European honeybee colony swarms. They're less selective with their nest site. They will use smaller cavities in the Americas. I've seen pictures of their honeybee colonies nesting in grills that haven't been opened, nesting in tires that are on the ground, nesting in abandoned cars, nesting in water meter boxes that the water meter man or woman will find when they're working those water meters. They will nest in much smaller cavities and frequently nest in the ground in areas where they are present. Another behavior that you see with Africanized honeybees is they tend to abscond more frequently than do European honeybees. Incidentally, this is true across a lot of the subspecies of honeybees that you find in Africa. So what does abscond mean? That means that the colony, for whatever reason, has decided to completely vacate the nest. Maybe their pest pressures are high, maybe their disease pressures are high, maybe there's low resource availability in the environment. They just leave, every one of them. It's not a swarm. They didn't split in half and leave some behind and take some with the swarm. They completely abandon the nest. They also have this peculiar behavior called nest usurpation, and research studies on this behavior have not really shed a lot of clarity on how frequent this behavior is, but it's still a unique behavior. Where an Africanized honeybee colony may swarm, that swarm may land close to a European honeybee colony. The swarm will then start exchanging food and pheromones with the bees in the European honeybee colony, and then the African bee swarm or the Africanized bee swarm will go into that colony and replace the existing European-derived queen with their own Africanized queen. So you had a European-derived colony, you now have an Africanized colony. We call this behavior usurpation. Again, the frequency that this occurs is not necessarily known, but it is something that these bees are capable of doing. Africanized honeybees tend to use a lot of propolis. Again, European honeybees can do the same thing, but it's a rule rather than the exception when you see Africanized bees. Some of the benefits of Africanized bees, dare I say benefits, is that they tend to have lower pest and pathogen pressures when they co-occur in the same areas that European honeybee colonies do. You hear a lot of beekeepers in Africa where they keep Apis mellifera scutellata, or beekeepers in South America and Central America where they still use this bee as their preferential honeybee, report lower varroa numbers and greater survivability than what we see with European honeybees kept in the same area. I really could go on for days when I'm comparing their behavior to that of European-derived honeybee stock. I will simply conclude by saying one of the most notable things about Africanized honeybees is the variation in behaviors that they express. I have worked Apis mellifera scutellata colonies in Africa, Africanized honeybees in the Americas, and yes, they can have very heightened defensiveness and I get a lot of attention, but they can also be gentle the next day and just display what I would consider very typical defensive behavior. If you think about why they display these characteristics, these would all be behaviors that would be beneficial to them in Africa, right? Where there may be droughts or nectar flows are moving so they're migratory and therefore abscond a lot. They have heightened defensiveness because there's honey badgers and other large mammals that might want to get into their nests. They're very flighty to try to get people away from what they keep otherwise small colonies. One of the key things about Africanized honeybees in the Americas is they just don't overwinter well. They don't form tight clusters and can't survive very cold winters. And that probably has done a lot to limit the distribution of this bee in the Americas. Also, rain can be an issue for them depending on what climate they are in. So climatically, they seem to have a very limited distribution. I know in the United States, for example, they seem to have hit the wall, so to speak. Where they are now, they've been for 10, 15, 20, almost 30 years. And their distribution does not seem to be spreading, and it seems to be because it's limited climatically. Now, I've said a lot of things that sound bad. But remember, there are beekeepers across Africa, South America, and Central America that keep this bee. In Africa, keep the pure Apis mellifera scutellata. In the Americas, keep the Africanized honeybee, and they prefer it. But this bee is not great in every circumstance, everywhere. Hopefully something that I've told you today has demystified this bee, will remove that killer moniker that comes with it, and that you'll appreciate this bee for what it is, a well-adapted bee that truly does well in the environments for which it is suited.